Hi, everybody. My name is Dallas Goldtooth. I'm the Keep It in the Ground campaign organizer for the Indigenous Environmental Network. I hope everyone can hear me fine. Make some noise if you can hear me good. Oh, I can see the room now. That typical Indians all sit in the back. No one wants to sit in the front. No one wants to get called upon. Old trauma, old school trauma right there. So my name is Dallas Goldtooth, and I live outside of Chicago myself. I'm a Dakota man from Lower Sioux Indian community in Minnesota, and I also grew up in South Dakota for a good part of my life. And I'm pretty thankful and proud to say that my organization and that me as an individual gets to work with a lot of frontline Indigenous communities across Turtle Island, fighting against extractive development, fighting to protect cultural and sacred sites, and just fighting or just living the way they want to live and self-determining the path of their future for themselves. So the Indigenous Environmental Network works with frontline communities, but we also work on an international level. A lot of times in like the UN, United Nations meetings, we typically help negotiate inside and outside strategy and make sure that Native voices, Indigenous people's voices are present and engaged in these international discussions. So the most recent example of that was at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as COP21, that happened in Paris last December. And that I wanted to kind of talk about that just because a lot of folks may have known about it, but a lot of folks didn't know about it, or really what is its impact for us as Indigenous peoples. From the convention, the meeting, this conference called COP21, was the 21st gathering of the world's major countries of the world to decide how to address climate change. And this was the big one because the countries, the major leaders decided that this is the one where we'll actually have a signed agreement written on, a signed agreement how we are going to address climate change. So it was a big deal. And, we felt it was critical that indigenous peoples are there inside and outside that conference to make sure that their voices are heard. So with that stated, it's from the perspective of our organization and me as an individual, that agreement was a failure. It did not meet the needed requirements for us to keep the world from getting hotter. A lot of it was business as usual. A lot of what was contained in the Paris Agreement was talking about how capitalism in the market can save the planet. And we, as the work that we do in the communities that we work with, it's not just environmental justice that we're fighting for, but we understand that when we talk about environmental justice, when we're talking about protecting sacred sites, wrapped in that conversation is also a critique on colonization. It's a critique against capitalism. It's a critique of the proliferation of a system that is designed to minimize our input in how we want to live our lives. And so we have to push back at that at all possible chance. So we went to Paris and we had I think about a delegation of 50 Indigenous peoples from North America that were there. And we worked with a lot of Native folks from across the planet and did a lot of really engaging, organizing outside the conference and did a lot of direct action to raise awareness about our perspective on things. So it was a pretty awesome moment because even though from our perspective that the Paris Agreement that came out of COP21 is a failure and it's just a continuation of business as usual, we still felt good because it just demonstrated that the power does not lie in industry's hands. The power does not lie in basically the top 1% countries, world's leaders. It lies in us as a people, and that this is where the change is happening. This is where the environmental justice movement is born out of the people, grassroots people, communities, and First Nations. So that was something that's really powerful, and I have to preface that because that this conversation about environmental justice, you have to take it from the big picture here. That we are looking to protect not only our community's ways, our traditional knowledge, our traditional fishing and hunting rights, all these things, but also we're fighting to protect Mother Earth overall, because the world's getting hotter, and we just keep putting more and more carbon into the air, and she's gonna get hotter and hotter and hotter, and we have a delicate system here that's out of balance. We know that. We've known it for a long time now. And so, what are we going to do to address that? What are we going to do to help Mother Earth get back into balance and keep the temperature down? So we have communities, grassroots communities, whether it's Lubicon Cree or Athabasca and Chippewa First Nation folks up in Fort McMurray, or ACFN, or whether you have folks on the West Coast and British Columbia, who are strategically addressing these destructive projects in their homelands, whether it's a pipeline, or whether it's tar sands, just strip mining, or in situ, or hydraulic fracking. There's a necessity for us to respond and shut this down and stop this development. But in the big picture here, we're also trying, the greater goal is to help get Mother Earth back into balance and help us as human beings renew our life ways and renew our relationship with Mother Earth. So that's the big picture. And I think I'm rambling now, so I'm just going to go like this for a little bit, because I feel weird because you're all looking at me here, and I'm like in this box here, like, in an old way. So I've been fighting. I helped in the Keystone XL fight. Was a major fight. I was actually the Keystone XL campaign organizer for a while now, and I feel really good saying I'm no longer the Keystone XL campaign organizer because we won that fight, and that's a triumph that we have to celebrate. And that it was First Nations people. It was a whole combination of people that all jumped into the fight and made that happen. But we have to pay recognition that it was the First Nations voice, it was Indigenous people's voice, our concerns, our arguments is what really contributed to that win. And when President Obama last November declared that he was not going to approve the national permit for the Keystone XL pipeline in the United States, there was a lot of like, yeah, hooray, Obama, hooray, hooray. And of course, that has to be recognized that he made his decision. But when that happened, we put out our organization put out a press statement, and it had two main things. The first main point is that he would not have made that decision if it was not for grassroots mobilization organizing. That Keystone XL would not have become an issue if it wasn't for grassroots people standing up and pushing back. It would not have happened if it wasn't for strategic organizing between communities in the tar sands and Ocheti Shakoi, also known as the Great Sioux Nation, relatives down in the Dakotas, and also with our Ponca relatives in Oklahoma. That we all worked and coordinated together to make sure our voices are heard, as well as coordinating with non-native folks, a lot of white farmers and ranchers who are along the route, and say, hey, we literally stand on common ground here, and let's work together to push back against this development. So that was the big thing, is that due recognition has to be paid to those grassroots people who made that happen. And then the second part is we wanted to clarify that it's a partial celebration, because the bottom half of the pipeline, which was in Oklahoma down to the Gulf Coast, did get approved. And Obama actually approved that. So like, how can we celebrate when those communities along that route were impacted and it was a failure for them? So we have to be mindful and truthful about our wins, but also make sure that we celebrate our wins and very strategically and use what we've learned from that fight to move on ahead. So where that leaves us today is we've proven that First Nations and Indigenous peoples can stop pipelines. I mean, that's been proven. We're seeing that on the West Coast in British Columbia. We're seeing it down in the Midwest. So we just have to keep on pushing forward and keep encouraging our tribal leaders to understand that. I think that's the greatest. Sometimes the struggle is that a lot of our tribal leaders on both sides of the medicine line may not fully understand the clout that we have as Native people within the political systems that we exist in, or they're just afraid to push back. And I think that we're in an amazing time right now. In the past 15 years, 20 years, we have a generation of tribal leaders who are more willing to push back against the national governments of Canada and the US. They're more willing to really learn from the examples from decades and decades of resistance from grassroots organizing. Say, hey, it's time for us as tribal governments to step up and really support the grassroots here. And so that's where a lot of our work is leading towards, is trying to educate our tribal leaders on the arguments and on the necessity to support those on the ground.